One last problem for us to look at, number 7. We want to write an equation that models the graph, and so let's look at how we can do that. All right, now when I look at this thing, I kind of see this symmetry line in the middle here. I see it's running from a positive 5 to 2, and then from a 2 down to negative 1. So in each instance there, to that midline is 3, so that tells me my amplitude is 3, so I'm going to throw a 3 in front right there. Now, I want to try and figure out how long it's taking me to get a full cycle. And I can see that I've gotten a full cycle once I hit the angle of pi over 2. So let's think about one way we can figure out then what that coefficient on our x term needs to be. I know that I take 2 pi and I divide it by that coefficient. I'm going to call it b, and that gives me my period. And my period here is pi over 2. So I can use that to my advantage. I can solve this equation for b. Let's reciprocate both sides. I can take b over 2 pi equals 2 over pi. Notice I just flipped both sides of the fraction. Now how do I get b by itself? I multiply by 2 pi. So I get b equals 2 over pi times 2 pi, which means the pi's cancel, and I'm left with 2 times 2 is 4. So I know my equation. And let's say this. I see this right here, that it's starting, when the x value is 0, it's starting at its middle value, and then it goes up, and then it goes back to 0, and then it goes down, and then it goes back to 0. That's a sine graph. So 3 sine of 4x, because the 4 I just figured out. But its middle value is at 2, so I need to say plus 2 right there. Now what's another way we could have identified that coefficient on the x term? Well, look at how many cycles we have between 0 and 2 pi. We have one cycle right there, we have a second cycle there, we have a third cycle there, and we have a fourth cycle right there, again showing us that coefficient of 4. Let's do the next one. Next one, what are we going to do? Again, I could write this as a sine graph, I could write it as a cosine graph. It doesn't really matter what you choose, it's a preference. But when I look at this, I see this minimum value right there, and it looks to be corresponding between halfway between 0 and pi over 2, which means that has to be pi over 4. So I see it starting at a minimum value. If it's going to start at a max or a minimum value, then we're talking about a cosine function, because sine starts at its middle, and this is starting at a minimum value. Because it's starting at a minimum, I know it's going to be a negative cosine function. So let's figure out what the amplitude is. Well, I'm going from a max of 0 down to a min of negative 4, which means its amplitude is 2. So that distance there is 2, that distance there is 2, so its amplitude is 2. So I get a negative 2 cosine of what's my phase shift? Well, it has started pi over 4 to the right, which means x minus pi over 4. Let's write it in terms of a sine graph also, just for fun. If it's a sine graph, then I need to be starting on my middle value. So here I see a middle value, and then a min, and then a middle, and then a max, and then a middle. That's a sine graph right there. So I could say y equals negative 2. It's going down first, again, so I know it's negative, right? So negative 2 sine of x. What's the phase shift this time? Well, this time the phase shift, it was starting at negative pi over 4, so that would be x plus pi over 4. Graph that on your calculator, you see that those things are going to be exactly the same, which is kind of cool. Let's do one last one real quick, 7c. I see here a middle starting value, then a minimum right there. That's telling me it's a negative sine graph, so negative sine of something. Oh snap, on that last one I forgot to account for this minus 2 right there. Its middle is at minus 2, so I need minus 2 there. And I would similarly need a minus 2 there. Sorry about that. There you go. Okay, but what about this one? I see middle, down, middle, up, middle. So it's a negative sine graph. What's its amplitude? Well, I can see from the middle to its min that is a distance of 3. So negative 3 sine something x. I can tell its period has been modified because I see that one full cycle gets it to the x value of 1. So I'm going to do like we did on the first one. I'm going to say 2 pi divided by that coefficient equals 1, and I'm going to solve for that coefficient. So I need to multiply by b, so I get 2 pi equals 1 times b is just b. Therefore, that's telling me my coefficient here has to be 2 pi, and voila, we are finished. Hope that made some sense. Come up with a random graph, random equation, try to sketch its graph, check it on a calculator, see what you can do.